The Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Today is the 14th of a series of lectures with Jim McKee. Support for this series is provided by Speedway Properties. Please join me in thanking Speedway Properties for their generous support of this videotaping. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. He has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books. He's written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. He's on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission. He is also a founding member for the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is the 14th of a series of over 25 talks during the next couple of years. The series is titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 14. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Well, we have not strayed from downtown Lincoln very far, so we're sticking with it. We've got something we're going to stick with till we get it right. The first picture we want to look at is the Oddfellows Temple. The Oddfellows worldwide claim to have links back to biblical times. We turn up Britain about 1745 and in the United States about 1806 and west of the Missouri by about 1835, something like that. Then with statehood, they move into Nebraska. The Oddfellows, my grandfather was an Oddfellow, in more ways than one perhaps. And I always thought, why would you associate with a group known as the Oddfellows? And he didn't really have a very good answer for me at all, but and neither did the Oddfellows, frankly. But apparently it was a group of trade laborers, and it was unusual or odd for these people to gather together. And odd, too, that they would contribute a penny a meeting towards the upkeep of the organization, and if there were extra monies left over from this, they would give it to the needy, the sick, and the distressed. And for someone to give away money in the 1700s was odd, and supposedly this is where the Oddfellows came from. Well, the Oddfellows were the first lodge in the city of Lincoln in 1867. All of the lodges at that point in time really started their lives without anything, and the Capital Commission felt that, first of all, I think we talked about the fact that Lincoln should have more than the two churches which existed here. Only one church was organized, and that was the Congregational Church, which will morph into First Congregational or First Plymouth Congregational Church. But the Methodists, you'll remember, owned the city of Lincoln, so in a way, they were here even though not technically organized. But the Capital Commission felt that there should be a wide variance of religions in the capital city, so they offered 3 lots to any denomination which would apply. 10 immediately did, 3 of which were variants of the Methodist Church, by the way. They also offered lodges, fraternal organizations, free gift of 1 lot if they would apply. Unfortunately, none of them were organized at that time, so none of them did actually apply for that free lot. But Capital Lodge number 11, in other words, the 11th Oddfellows chapter in the state of Nebraska, finally did meet April 21st of 1868, and they were the first fraternal organization to meet in the city of Lincoln. Because there was no really good place to meet, they met at the second floor, or on the second floor of Tingley's Drugstore, which I think we talked about a couple of times ago, which was at 123 South 10th Street. In other words, on the west side of 10th Street, just south of the alley back of the terminal building. And this is where most all of the original meetings held of all the fraternal organizations until they got going. So they met there April the 21st of 1868. By 1878, they had several chapters just in the city of Lincoln, including one of my favorites, the Improved Order of the Red Men, who kindled their council fires the first Thursday in every moon in the wigwam. Who they were or where this wigwam was, I'm not sure. In 1881, in May, the Oddfellows, having lost their chance at the free lots, purchased the lots on the northeast corner of 11th and L, and then began construction of this building, which was described as 4 stories, although it seems to be 3, they must have been including the basement, to cost about $20,000 and furnish it with $5,000 worth of furniture. At that time, there were 3 Oddfellows lodges just in the city of Lincoln. One of them, Germania number 67, was an entirely German-speaking lodge. Practically everybody in the city of Lincoln was a member of at least one, and sometimes 2 or 3 lodges. The governor, everybody were members of the Oddfellows. 1966, this building was getting a little bit on the tired and worn side, I would have to say. I spoke upstairs. You entered over here on the side and went up to the 2nd floor, and the building was really getting pretty decrepit, I thought, at the time, 1966. And it didn't last very long after that. It was sold, and the Rebecca Lodge and the Oddfellows 3 chapters in Lincoln went out on North 56th Street, right across the street west from what's now the Lutheran High School and Middle School, and built a new lodge hall there, which is still there, and they still meet there, both Rebecca and IOOF. The building came down and became a gravel parking lot. They used the funds from selling the building to build their new building out on 56th Street. And of course, now there's a parking garage there, which attaches over the street to a parking garage, which attaches to the Cornhusker Hotel. Now, I'm not sure how this worked. Let's try this. Lots of buttons, okay. One of the first photographs I bought of the city of Lincoln I got for a dime, and this is it. 2 or 3 of them were from a dime. This is 11th Street, and we are looking towards the north. We can see the University Hall has been completed. That went up in 1869, the first classes in 1871. And we're looking from probably about M Street, something like that. And I show it only at this point not to dwell on it, but rather the fact that originally the main street of Lincoln was probably O Street. That was the the south boundary of the city of Lancaster, became what they considered to be the center section of the city of Lincoln, and was one of the 120-foot wide streets. 11th Street, we see here, was also 120 foot wide because it led to the university. So I come back to this periodically through the programs, looking back at 11th Street, because the main street of Lincoln started, as I said, on O Street. But then it seemed to convert over to 11th Street. O Street was taken, first of all, because it was a cattle driving trail. Then it switched over, and a lot of the businesses were on 11th Street. Then it switches back to O Street. Then it switches to 13th Street. 13th Street, in fact, even ends up with the Montgomery Ward's building, which is across the street to the south of the Cornhusker Hotel. And now it's a 3-story office building. That was built for Montgomery Ward's. They were so certain that 13th Street was going to become the prominent street. Then it went back to O Street again. And now today, if you would look at the number of retail institutions on O Street and what is the main street, you might think 27th Street, with those 2 huge shopping centers clear on the south and clear on the north. So it does move around. But we'll come back to 11th Street periodically to see what's going on. The next picture, we will go down to 11th and South and talk about 2 institutions which are going to be there. First is the Home for the Friendless, and it started in Nebraska in 1876, but it was a private charity for unfortunate girls. We do know who the unfortunate girls were, don't we? We don't have to explain that one. And unfortunate girls, the neglected and orphans, and elderly women. You'll notice there's no mention of men or boys in here at all. But they didn't have a building. They used private homes and sort of farmed kids out. It wasn't until 1881 that the legislature finally got around to establishing something which might be considered a state institution. They provided $5,000 for the opening of the building and all the flour and milk they would need. Pretty generous of them in order to build and operate for 1 year. Then in 1882, the following year, they acquired this property, 11th and South, so considerably out of the downtown area. And they built it. They thought it would house as many as 12 inmates. Now, today we use the word inmate in an entirely different way than they did in 1881. If you were the ward of a state in any capacity, an orphan, penitentiary, insane asylum, hospital, you were considered an inmate, and you were so counted as an inmate. Was not considered derogatory, as we might think of it today. So the building was originally designed, it faced towards the west. Then by 1888, they were only taking orphans. They sent the elderly to Omaha, and the unfortunate girls went to Milford, to what they then called the industrial school. Talk about euphemism. Now, what that meant, I don't know, but they called the unfortunate girls became the. Well, in 1905, the Orthopedic Hospital is going to join the fray. And at that point in time, there is a woman physician in Lincoln, Dr. Lenore Perky was her name, and she was a homeopathic surgeon. And she became the staff physician for the Home for the Friendless. And as she began working there, she realized that there was also a need developing. There were two, what she called crippled children, and these words, many of them are no longer used anymore, but I will use the words as they used them, crippled children. And she thought that probably there were more crippled children than two across the state of Nebraska. And in fact, she immediately turned up, just with a very cursory examination, that there were 73 under physician's care in the state. So she went to the New York State Orthopedic Hospital and decided that coming back to Lincoln, that she would try to get such a hospital started in the city of Lincoln. So in 1902, she lobbied the state of Nebraska and was joined by two other doctors immediately, both Lincoln doctors, Dr. E.B. Finney, some of you have heard his name, and Dr. H. Winnett Orr, O-R-R. Then in 1904, the physicians convinced a senator, a state senator, from Blue Springs, Nebraska, to sponsor a bill and put it through the two houses of the legislature. A bill was drafted, and it provided $25,000 per year just to maintain and operate a hospital for crippled and deformed children. Originally, if you were a child that needed care, you could be put in this institution, but the county had to pay for it, not the parents and not the state. So it wasn't what it turned out to be, and in fact, by the time the bill got to Governor Mickey for his signature, instead of $25,000, the legislature had whittled it down to $10,000. Because Governor Mickey at that time said that he doubted that there were 20 children in the entire state of Nebraska who could benefit from such a bill. So the doctor and her friends got together, and they quickly put together a list of 100 children. And Governor Mickey, to his credit, signed the bill instantly and admitted that he was wrong. Does the governor ever admit he's wrong? Well, he did. Dr. Winnett Orr became the head of the hospital at that time. And it grew and it grew and it grew. By 1906, they had 26 patients. They added, by the way, in 1915, another building to the west. And in 1930, a third building to the west. So the orthopedic function of the hospital was growing and growing and growing. But by 1971, the numbers had begun to drop, interestingly. Private institutions began to take over, and the legislature said that in 1971 they wanted this institution phased out completely. They phased out the orthopedic function, which in the meantime had built around that building and looked more like this. They had taken the orthopedic function mostly to the University of Nebraska Medical Center at Omaha. So it didn't go away, but it was simply moved. The state then temporarily used the buildings there for impaired vision teaching, but by the early 1970s, the building, as we see it here, has been boarded up and is about ready to go down. And this is just before the snow fence goes up. And at that point in time, of course, is when I go in and try to take pictures. There was really nothing left of the building at that point in time. It had deteriorated so badly. So early 70s, it went away, and that, of course, became where the Lancaster Manor, I think it's called, the county home, is located on that, roughly on that same property. Here we're going out to the Cottington Street Bridge, looking from an aerial view across the bridge towards the east, and we can see J Street, incidentally, or coincidentally, I should say, lines up perfectly with the Capitol building. So when I was a kid, this was where we would chide my father to take us to Pioneers Park on a Sunday, and then afterwards we would come back and drive over that great, rickety, wooden, unprepared, unrepaired bridge, which didn't exactly line up with Cottington, if anybody ever noticed it. Cottington comes like this, and then it goes like this over the bridge, which always kind of astounded me as a kid. But at any rate, we'll get to that. And then right in the middle, there was a sign that said, "No stopping on the bridge." It was right at J Street. Now, that sign is interpreted to mean this is where you should stop to get that perfect view of looking down O Street right towards the Capitol building. Well, backing up a little bit, by 1905, of course, the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad had arrived in Lincoln in July of 1870. You remember that very clearly. It was 1870. Wayne and I remember that. But they did not have anything here because they really thought Lincoln wouldn't develop much of anything other than just maybe a few passengers and so forth. But by 1905 was obvious they had to choose a place to get more of a yard in the city of Lincoln. They investigated 4 different sites. One was the village of Burnham, and Burnham is a little nondescript area adjacent to Yankee Hill, but directly next to Yankee Hill Brickyard, the city of Burnham, and there was a stockyards at Burnham, ultimately. Havelock, of course, which was developed in the 1890s as a community for repairing locomotives and building cars later. It seemed like a natural place to put yards, but they didn't look at that too seriously. Then they looked to the northwest of the present depot yards, and ultimately they chose this site, which is southwest of the city, because the land was cheap, and it was adjacent to the trackage, and adding more land to their parcel would be a good time to do it when it was cheap. So they initiated several things here. They had a 40-stall roundhouse, which is I think that's almost a complete roundhouse. It was termed a classification yard, this part of it. And a classification yard means that we're going to build trains here. We're going to have cars coming in, and we'll separate them out into separate trains, which will have different destinations. Very simple. When completed, it originally had a number of tracks, but by the time World War II had ended, there were 36 parallel tracks, if you count along in the widest part of what they call the bowl. And in the bowl itself and the 2 tracks leading from and to it, there were about 65 miles of railroad track laid in there, 290 switches. And the cars would come from the west end, which had an elevation of about 10 feet higher than the east end. They would push the cars up here. We start down here. You can see down here to 3, and it comes down literally to 1. They would have the car sitting on the top of this 10-foot high hill and release it. Gravity would cause the car to roll towards the east, and through a series of towers and those hundreds of switches, they could manipulate which one of the trains that car will end up on. And of course, as you're sitting up there watching it, you can watch these cars drift off towards the east, and then bang, they couple together. It was great. I remember it. Worked very well, well, maybe too well. By the height of World War II and the wartime traffic, they said they were putting together they're handling about 800 cars per shift. So I don't know whether there were 2 or 3 shifts a day, but 800 cars a shift. And the number which they used by wartime was that they were using annually about 1/8 of a million cars were going through this classification yard. And you got to remember, this classification yard is just a tiny little drop in the bucket compared to the largest classification railroad yard in the world, which is at North Platte. So everything works fine. 1983 comes along, and what do? They decide that they're going to reduce the drift from 10 foot down to 5 foot. We're going to start, instead of allowing the cars to just go down by gravity and hit the next one, we're going to move them by diesel. I think the idea was, well, what would happen if gravity would fail? They wanted a standby. But at any rate, 1983, the towers were all closed, and away that function. I still classify cars there, but not using it. Now, back to Cottington Street. One of the reasons this bridge was not repaired was it did not belong to the city of Lincoln. It wasn't a city street. That's why it didn't align with Cottington Street. The railroad had built that bridge really for only one purpose, and that was to get employees over the tracks without having to bump, 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 bump. So they built it for their employees, but it was close enough that pretty soon the city has built connection to this on Cottington Street. The city didn't maintain it, and the railroad didn't want to maintain it either, because they did not want to encourage people to use it. But they did have some liability involved, so they maintained it. But, those of us who remember you'd be driving along and there'd be planks missing. None of them were bolted down. It was rumbledy. Now, of course, you can go by on the bypass that goes around there, but the concrete walls are high enough you really can't see or listen. And if you stop, you would stop at your own peril. There's no reason to do that anymore. In the year 1969, which is the last year I have figures for it, quite a long while ago, 1,751,000 odd cars were sorted at that point in time. Maybe one of my favorite houses. One time I put together a program of my favorite Lincoln buildings, and this is certainly one of my favorites because it's going to be the site of where my office was for 17 years, not in this house. It's owned by a man by the name of John D. Mcfarland, and it's spelled any way you want to spell it. Mcfarland himself sometimes spelled it M-C, sometimes M-A-C, sometimes with a capital F, sometimes with a lowercase f. I've actually got his signature in all different ways. So I think it was M-A-C, capital F, technically, but who knows? He didn't seem to know. He was born in Pennsylvania, 1846, served in the Civil War, came to Brownville with statehood. Then in 1871, he began working as a land agent for the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. And I think we've talked about these land agents. These were guys like Mr. Phillips, who gave us Phillips, Nebraska, Mr. McFarland, and others who became quite wealthy in this organization because they operated two land companies that were owned by the Burlington Railroad, primarily the South Platte Land Company and the Lancaster Land Company. And one of the things they did was they sold off land that had been given to them by the federal government. And the other thing they did was they laid out towns every 7 miles. The other thing they did was they really set the exact sites where the railroad would go. So they became quite wealthy. In 1872, Mr. McFarland, not living in this house yet, married his first wife, whose name was Carrie. Carrie, whose father was a man by the name of Amasa Cobb. Amasa Cobb was the first president of the First National Bank. He was mayor of the city of Lincoln in 1875 and later a Nebraska Supreme Court judge. So he married well, let's say, and he also is going to make money hand over fist. So as his professional life proceeded and his married life proceeded, he moved once and then decided to build this house on the northwest corner of 14th and Q Streets. The address of the house would be 1320 Q specifically, depending on how you orient it. It was completed in 1886. It's red brick, stone, 2.5 stories, slate roof, and 10 separate fireplaces because, of course, there was no central heating in those days. It was considered the marvel of Lincoln. One report at that time, done in the late 1880s, said that it was the most expensive house built west of the Missouri River. Now, you know, everything in Lincoln, if you look at the right quote, is the best or the largest west of the Missouri River. Everything at the university was the best and largest, certainly. And you got to stop and think that if this was the best, finest house west of the Missouri River, that includes a lot of territory, you know. Denver wasn't developing yet to that great an extent, but certainly Denver and all the way to San Francisco and Los Angeles, where you'd think there must have been some pretty spectacular houses. But let's look at this house a little more carefully. And it may be more than we think. Cost $50,000, if I didn't say that. The second floor featured each rooms being paneled in a solid wood from a different country, like Philippine mahogany, for example. Walnut in one room. And these were not veneer, these were solid woods. In fact, the entranceway was also in oak and walnut and considered to be an absolutely spectacular entrance. But McFarland, although he was happy with the house in a way, he obviously realized that maybe his wife, maybe Carrie had some part in this, but he had spent way more from a house than probably was warranted. And the story goes that he trained his parrot every day when he returned walking home from his office in the depot, which is where we think of the depot down on 7th Street, not the new one. But he would walk home every day, and he trained his parrot so when he opened the door and walked into the house, the parrot would say, "Damned fool." True or not, we don't know. About the same time that he occupied this house, he took on a couple partners, a guy by the name of John Clark and another man by the name of Albert E. Tuzlin. And together, they bought the land which they would then donate 300 acres of to the Burlington Railroad to build the Havelock shops. Basically, the land that they own went from 48th Street to 70th Street, from Adams Street to Salt Creek. Just a tiny little piece of land. And, you know, if they weren't already wealthy, that would have been enough to cement them, I think. In the meantime, there was another bank in Lincoln called the Marsh Brothers and Mosher Bank. And it became a national bank in 1883, then became the Capital National, which our friend Mr. Mcfarland was with. Then a national depression came in 1893, and the bank suspended its operations on January 21st of that year for dishonesty. And I think, Matt, did you finally write this story up? I'm not sure. You did some research on it, I know. It was a little bit of finagling in there going on. And as a major stockholder, the board of directors came to Mr. Mcfarland and asked him to save the institution. He poured literally his entire fortune into saving the Capital National. Didn't quite save it, but he did manage to underwrite a lot of the losses of individuals and the stockholders. At one time, we thought he had underwritten the whole thing, but apparently that's not quite true. The state of Nebraska itself lost $236,000, and that was a lot of money at that point in time. So, was it the most spectacular house? I don't know, but we'll see in a minute another building which was built, and I'll relate back to this and see what 50,000, because it's impossible to say, what did $50,000 in 1880s, what does it mean today? Because it depends on whether you're in real estate or diamonds or coins or whatever. Different things travel through history at different rates. He, of course, he lost everything during that depression and moved to live with his daughter in California. The house was sold many times. It became Doctors Ramey and Carruthers Hospital. Most of the original hospitals in Lincoln were just in private residences. But his was not exactly a general hospital, although it could be considered that because he made it available to all physicians in the city. Then a man by the name of James McLaughlin bought it and turned it back into a private residence. Then it became a fraternity house, Tau Kappa Epsilon. Sort of back and forth, it became a rooming house. And a friend of mine's parents, actually, when he was going to the University of Nebraska, lived in the house. Then Martin and Day Company purchased it. And Martin and Day was building around Lincoln at that time. They were also a farm management company. And still, I think the company, George Day's son, still operates the farm management company. But Martin and Day were building around the city of Lincoln a series of Safeway store, Skelly filling station combinations. And they will tear down the house at that point in time and build a Safeway store and Skelly filling station. They will build one where Tico's restaurant is. That is a old Safeway store. The filling station is long gone. There was one at 17th and South. It's still there. The filling station is a Valentino's, and the Safeway store is a print shop. There is one at about 26th and O, and the Safeway store is a YWCA, and the Skelly filling station has been almost anything you can think of. Last I know I think it was a check cashing facility. I'm not sure, but that's a great Art Deco building. This one came down. And the Safeway store that was built in its stead later was a Skell Gas. Then we leased it from Dick Martin, and that's where my office was for 17 years. The Skelly filling station was torn down, and that's been replaced now with a Wendy's. So that's where we are. We're looking towards the northwest. And the house itself, we'll see in a minute an aerial view of the house and see that it sits on a quarter of a square block of land. So it was not small by any means. And here we are looking at that. We can see it just barely over here, and you can see it looks much larger looking down on it. And this right here is P Street, and in a minute we'll be talking about this building right here, which is still standing. This is still standing. There's virtually nothing else in this picture that's still standing. Next building we want to talk about is also on Q Street. It's at 11th and Q. Yeah?
When did that big house come down?
The question is, when did that big house come down? And the Mcfarland house came down after the Great Depression. And I'm thinking that it's possible that Martin and Day actually used some of the timbers in that house to construct the Safeway store in the 30s. Because the attic in that building, which we stored things in, had probably a 10-foot ceiling in it. And all of the timbers up there were used, or a lot of them. So I'm wondering if some of the timbers might have ended up there. And that building is still there. It's right next to Nebraska Book, right absolutely next to it, to the east side. And now the university. And I don't know whether the university has purchased the building or whether it leases it from the Martin estate. But that, in the 30s, certainly. Okay. So now, 11th and Q Streets, this is the southeast corner of the intersection. Kind of fun to look at this building, because if we look at what was there before this building, the answer is nothing. This was actually far enough to the north that they thought it would just be mostly residential, so it was divided up into more lots than ordinarily. Some places in Lincoln you'd have 30 lots, some places as little as 10, 12. Downtown, more commercial would be larger lots. But nothing was built on this corner. And a man by the name of Mr. Barnes came along, and Mr. Barnes didn't live in Lincoln. He lived east of the city, is what, if you looked him up in the city directories, east of the city. And in fact, where he lived was the south edge of what would later become University Place. That developed in 1888. His house was at 48th and Vine on the northeast corner of the intersection there. But he decided in 1884 to build a hotel in downtown Lincoln. And it opened January the 5th of 1885. He called it originally the Gorham, Gorham. He named it for one of the two managers of the hotel, Gorham and Brown. Mr. Gorham got his name on the building. And I learned a long time ago, never name a business you're associated, I learned it the hard way, never name a business you're associated with after one of your employees, no matter how well known they are. Mr. Gorham and Mr. Brown lasted only 1 year as managers of the hotel. So it changed. Mr. Barnes still owned it, but he renamed it then in 1886 the Windsor, which is a sort of a name which could go to anything. Could be a person's name, but actually not. So the Windsor had two managers by the name of Glass and Montrose. They lasted about a year. And if we watch it, these managers last a year or two, basically, so a good thing not to do. At that point in time, they announced that they would add on to the 3-story with complete basement hotel, which, when completed, I forgot to mention this, and this is where we would ask you to compare the $50,000 cost of the house back that Mr. Mcfarland was building. This building, which literally is a half block long, comes clear up to the alley here, was built and furnished for $10,000. So now let's back up and look at the Mcfarland house, which cost $50,000 exclusive furniture, and ask again, could it be the most expensive palatial house west of the Missouri River? Well, it begins to look like it certainly was a lot more house than we would think it was. Whether it really lived up to that or not, I don't know. So the Windsor exists there, changed its management every couple of years. By 1889, it's managed by a man who also manages the Paddock Hotel in Beatrice. That building is still there. 1900, roughly, just a little before that, they went to build again another addition just to the east, and they got the foundations poured. But in 1903, another depression came along, and so the foundations were there, but the hotel did not get added onto at that point in time. But over here, across the alley, it did get added onto, in a manner of speaking. Another building was built over there, which was called the Windsor Block, or the Windsor Annex, and that building's still there. That building will later be called the Walton Building, when Walton Ferris owns it. And it is connected to the back or the north side of what we call the old Chamber of Commerce building, where now Misty's is located. And this is the building which has been empty now for several years. It was full of tenants, but they emptied it out thinking they were going to tear it down and build a tower and connect it to the Chamber of Commerce building. But that didn't come about, so now it's empty, no tenants, and it's harder to get somebody back in after that point in time. So the annex is still there, and the annex at that time had a restaurant in it and a bar and so forth. So they, in a way, enlarge the building, but not directly connected to it. Then, after the Depression, they're going to go back on the foundations and build an apartment house instead of adding onto the hotel. So we'll have a building that is kind of U-shaped. This is the flat side of the U, and then it goes like this. And in the middle is a gasoline tank, which they stored gasoline because that's the way originally a lot of the buildings were lighted. It was by gasoline lights. When they had the bar over here, they advertised themselves as the best stocked bar in the city of Lincoln. They also, within the hotel, had every facility that was needed. This would have been the original lobby. It had, as you can see, electric lights and acetylene lights or gas lights. It also had a telegraph station, no telephones at this point in time. And they had a dog. But dogs are tough to take pictures of because they don't stand still. And so he appears as a blur in this picture. We're standing looking into the building, towards the east in this picture. What else about this picture? This is probably a carbon arc lamp. I'm not absolutely sure. One that would start with 2 carbon arcs. Very, very bright. By 1905, they still call it the Windsor Hotel. And this is the revised lobby, and this is how I remember the building. They redid it. And I had a friend, George Rao, who had a bookstore, antique store, along that 11th Street front, second door from the corner. And by that time, and of course I was high school age at that point in time, and this was a fascinating building to me, because by 1937, this was the oldest hotel building in the city of Lincoln. So now we're talking in the 1950s. It's really old. And the basement is a warren. And you could go from George's basement. There were tunnels leading off over to what they thought was going to be the hotel addition, still went over and connected to the apartment house over there. And actually there were doors on either end, but they were sealed off, but locked, but you could go all over in the building. Sort of a fascinating sort of a place. And it didn't look great at that time. It was falling apart pretty much. It had 2 kitchens. One of the kitchens was in the basement. This is probably the one that was on the second floor. And we don't know exactly why they had 2 kitchens, whether one was for catering or what, I don't know. When the Hayward Military Academy burned to the ground, and the Hayward Military Academy became the building which we today think of as the men's reformatory. We talked about that probably 10 or 12 times back. The boys were brought, and they were quartered in the Windsor Hotel. And that building, of course, the men's reformatory has been rebuilt, and I think I still every year say it's destined to come down this year, but it's still there as far as I know. It's just hanging on. Okay, well, they revised the hotel periodically, and at one point in time, they even lowered the rates in the rooms down to 75 cents. Then, at the time this picture is taken, rooms were advertised as being $2.25 and down, which is kind of an unusual way to put it. Usually say 75 cents and up or something. But then it sort of just plugs along. This is an interesting picture taken up on probably the second floor, maybe the third floor. We're looking towards the north, and we don't know what's going on for sure, of course, but there's mandolins here. People playing the mandolin, and the university at that time and the city of Lincoln had a lot of mandolin clubs, sort of the forerunner. All over the country. And, I don't know what they were doing, but they were having some sort of a meeting in here. And this right here is an atrium going up, so I think it's part of the second floor. And you can see here there are 2 cords. This young lady is sitting on a swing that is suspended down through that. It's kind of an interesting picture, kind of bizarre. Who knows what's going on there? Well, this is still the Windsor Hotel. You can see it's quite a bit later because it's also become a spot where the bus stops, the Burlington Route bus stop, and it's called the Old Tom Hotel Nebraskan now. And Old Tom was probably named for the guy who was the manager at that time. Like his name was Tom something or other, and I can't remember what. But the building still looks pretty much as it did in its original days. But by 59, the city council was realizing how old this hotel was. they said that the upper 2 floors needed to be either brought up to speed for electrical and plumbing or closed. And by that time, the building had changed hands. It was bought by A.G. Van Horn. Van Horn also owned the Congress Inn Motel out on the O Street side. And in fact, when he built the Congress Inn, one of the things he did is he took the Chinese restaurant from in this building and moved it out to the Congress Inn. And it was there for a good long time. I don't believe it's there anymore. Well, Mr. Van Horn could not see his way clear to putting a lot of money in a building that was that old. So he was sat on it for a little while thinking about it when the city council just plain condemned the 2 floors. And so what he had done is he had bought the building from Bennett and Martin, had been the mayor of the city of Lincoln for a long time. And it's interesting, too, for watching the values of the hotel, because in 1952, Bennett Martin bought it for $9,759, 52. When he sold it to Van Horn in 55, he went for $200,000. So what was Mr. Van Horn to do? He gave the building back to Mr. Martin. He just quit-claimed it back to him. And the terminal company, which was actually the title holder of the building. And on December the 18th, down it came. They tore it down. And on its stead, they built that gravel parking lot, which stood there until, ultimately, a half a block building was built in there by Sampson Construction Company. Mostly a parking garage, 48,600 square feet parking garage, 175 stalls. I think it's 6 stories tall, something like that. And then you have the Hewlett Center on one end of it. That was built on the site. So we ended up with a parking lot turned into a parking garage. But we tore down at that time, one of the oldest buildings in the city of Lincoln. And if you've gone to the Lead Center, you probably have parked in that parking garage. And if you go to that parking garage, it's called the Q Place Garage, 11th and Q. And if you do go into it and you're going to go to the Lead, try not to park on the top floor. Because if you do, it's going to take you longer to get out than whatever you sat through at the Lead Center. It's a slow business getting out of there. Now this is another picture taken, the aerial view, or the one looking down on Mcfarland House, was taken from the top of the building. Is it the cornerstone or the center stone? I can't ever remember which, at 12th and O Street. One's the center, is it the center stone or the cornerstone? The tall stone building, okay? And there were a series of pictures taken from the top of that building. This is the second one. Last time we were looking this direction, and now we're looking over towards the University Hall, Pharmacy College, and so forth that we've talked about. But the building we want to talk about briefly right now is this one right here, which is the Evans Laundry Building. We can see a lot of things in this picture. This is from the Lincoln Picturesque. What was the exact title? Descriptive and Picturesque, something like that. Something like that. So there's a lot of pictures taken in there, and it's as sharp as a tack. It doesn't come up that way on this screen particularly, but by the time we translate it. This is the building that we're looking at now. It's been sort of painted white at this point in time. It was established in 1885 by a man by the name of C.J. Pratt, and it was called the Peerless Laundry, or the Peerless Dry Cleaners at that time. Then it was purchased 3 years later by Mr. Evans from Omaha for $15,000, which is a pretty good chunk of money. He also bought the land next to it right here and built another little building in it. And at that point in time, he had laundries scattered around the state of Nebraska and called himself the largest launderer in the state of Nebraska. Probably was. I don't know how many other places he had. But by 1923, in Lincoln, he said he had 100 and some employees, as many as 150 during certain times. He had 5 electric trucks and 35 motor truck, gasoline trucks, to deliver laundry. And also next door over here, we'll see to the left will be the Grand Hotel, and he's going to lease part of the Grand Hotel also for this operation. This building right here is interesting because the upper floor was primarily a dormitory. He operated that business 24 hours a day, washing and drying and ironing laundry, and some of the men actually lived in the building. His advertisement in 1923, and this photograph looks like it's dated 1949, something like that. It doesn't sound right. 29, let's make it. Doesn't sound right. 1923, an advertisement he ran, and it was primarily addressed not to individuals, but to hotels and large consumers of laundry. He said in his advertisement, I remember an advertisement, just by definition, is going to be an exaggeration, I always think. He said that they would pick up the linen at your hotel at 6 a.m. in the morning. They would take that laundry, they would wash it, dry it, and iron it, and get it back to you by 7 o'clock in the morning. Now, not possible. I mean, it's just absolutely not possible. My thought is probably what was going on is we had generic fungible towels and sheets. You know, he'd send you over 50 sheets. He'd send you 50 sheets right back in an hour, but they wouldn't be the same sheets. They're just absolutely impossible, but rather clever. Now later, of course, this entire quarter block will be purchased by Nebraska Book Company. This will be the wholesale division of Nebraska Book. We'll be in there until they move way out on Cornhusker Highway. And then ultimately over to the trade center by the penitentiary. But they'll have the whole quarter of a block at one point. Great place. All of the buildings are connected by either tunnels underneath or over the alleyway you could get over. And as a kid, my wife played in there because her father started the wholesale division of Nebraska Book. But later on when I worked there, it was just great. And for a kid, you know, they would go down on a Sunday and get turned loose in this building, and there were little nooks and crannies and stairways that went nowhere and just all kinds of fun. So that came down for the Lead Center. Another hotel in Lincoln is the Lindell, or maybe Lindell. I'm not sure. I called it the Lindell, but I've heard people call it the Lindell, and I'm not sure. There were other Lindell hotels around the Midwest, at least a couple or more, and I don't know that there was a connection between them or where the name Lindell came from. And I have tried to find out, and I have been unsuccessful. So there's your assignment. So next April, somebody will come back and tell me where the name Lindell came. Well, this corner right here really originally had a large house on it. It belonged to a man by the name of Mr. Townley, Townley. And it was turned into a hotel by Mr. Townley called Townley Hall. All of the hotels, and we may have talked about this a little bit a long time ago, the hotels originally were almost always by the railroad station. People came in, and that's where they wanted to stay. So we had a lot of hotels down there originally. But Mr. Townley knew, along with Mr. Tishner, I think we talked about him at 13th and K, that there needed to be a hotel somewhere close to the Capitol building for people attending sessions or appearing before a committee or something. So he turned the house into the Townley House Hotel. Then in 1880, Mr. Townley got the franchise to operate the restaurant in the Burlington Depot. So he sold the Townley House to a man by the name of H.E. Clark. H.E. Clark sold it again to a man by the name of Dr. Hoover, Hoover. Now, Dr. Hoover picked up the house, and he moved it to the north on the alley. And he maintained the house then as the kitchen for the hotel. And he began building the building we see here. And you can see various stages of construction. One of them is just that plane, then over to here. Then he started adding various segments towards the north until ultimately he will build over the alley. You could drive through the alley here. And if today you could look at that house, you would see that it comes down where there's a garden back of what used to be First Federal. That the hotel actually went all the way over the alley, and you could drive through it and go down. It occupied right up next to the back of the Chapin building, which was later First Federal, and then it became Tyrone Bank, right? Tierone, or Tyrone, if you want to look at it that way. And is it Great Western Bank now?
Yes.
I'm not sure. Banks and names they change so fast. So at any rate, what else can we see? We can see the YMCA building in this picture right here. Made of cut stone and Milwaukee cold pressed brick, 4 stories tall. The carpet, the original carpet for the building was supplied by our old buddies Miller and Payne. It had been operated as a temperance hotel for a while. 1905, one of the most famous guests was probably a man by the name of James Whitcomb Riley, who was a poet in the United States. And he stayed in the hotel and learned that a man that worked for the Lincoln Journal who was a poet, which he considered, his domain, wanted to interview him. Bix was the guy's name, B-I-X, B-I-X-B-Y, actually. Well, Mr. Riley did not want to be interviewed or entertained, so he hung a little sign on his door that said, there are moments when one wants to be alone, and these are them. He locked the door. The interesting part, and this was all later reported in the Journal, of course, he's gonna be an old downfall. He can't get out. The door is locked, and he can't get out. So the hotel staff has to come and extract him over the transom. So he probably would have been better off to talk to the guy, but nonetheless, that was 1903. By 1910, Miller and Payne decided that it should go back to being a temperance hotel. Miller and Payne families were both great temperance advocates. So they purchased the hotel, closed the saloon, or the bar in there. Lasted about 3 years before they pretty much bankrupted it. During that period of time, it was one of the places that William Jennings Bryan liked to bring people to Lincoln because it was a temperance hotel. And it also was said that he liked to stand in the ballroom, and there was a balcony around it, and Mr. Bryan liked to get up there and give speeches from the balcony. Anyway, it went back after Miller and Payne lost it. It went back. They turned the taps on again, set up the bar, and it was again profitable. By 1921, Miller and Payne thought, I'm sure we could have done that. And so they bought it again. There's probably at some point in here, one of these purchases was probably because they had not been paid for something they sold to the hotel. But that's conjecture and a statement, but not fact necessarily. We never want to let facts stand in the way of a good story, right? Well, so they tried again from 1919 to 1921, and again, it didn't work. At that point in time, later on rather, KFOR radio was up on the second floor, and the hotel has grown like topsy. 1952, who buys it? Bennett Martin. He buys it for $225,000 and promptly sells it to Union Savings and Loan for an undisclosed amount of money. I'm not sure what Union paid for it. 1969, of course, the hotel is torn down and becomes the site of the First National Bank. This is, as I remember it, the Lindell Palace. There was actually, the Kings had the restaurant in there for a while, the interior of the building. And there it comes down. Just before it came down, Kenny King's son, Jerry, was a good friend of mine. And I thought, I love to get into old buildings. And one of the things when I go into an old building is I like to see the basement and the attic, because those are the parts of the building which are least changed, oftentimes. So I told Jerry I wanted to come and go through the building. He said, well, you're welcome to come down and I'll give you a tour. And when I went down, one of the things that, I don't know what it shows in this picture, it doesn't show here, but along the 13th Street side, originally all of the downtown buildings, or many of them, had walk-under steps. On the sidewalk outside, you would walk down a series of steps, put you in the basement, and in the basement there would be various businesses. Remember Cliff's Smoke Shop? That's the remnant of one of those. Well, in the basement of the Lindell, like many hotels, there was a barber shop, among other things. So Jerry said, well, the first thing is I can't take you to the attic because there is no attic. There's just kind of a crawl space up on top and pretty much a flat roof, which is, as we know in Nebraska, hardly ever a good idea. But he said, let's look in the basement. So he took me down in the basement, and we're going to run over a little bit in answer to that question. When we got into the basement, along the 13th Street side, it was like walking in underground Atlanta. There were shops along there with glass fronts and doors, just as if you had been outdoors. And there was the barber shop, a glass front, a door, and you could look in, and you could see against the north wall mirrors along the wall and I'll call it a bar, but a marble top where they would have set the Lucky Tiger, where you put your combs and Barbasol and that stuff in it. And the floor was black and white tiles. The chairs were gone. The barber shop was closed, of course. It was kind of eerie because there were these businesses which were not businesses along there. And in there, on the floor, were, I would say, hundreds of suitcases lined up like with a string and a sextant. So I asked Jerry, what on earth are those? And he said, well, that's simple. He said, from the day the hotel opened, people would come here and stay and not be able to pay their bill, and they would confiscate their luggage. And they would keep it. And he said at that time, state law said they kept it. If 20 years later, 30 years later, you came back and paid your hotel room, you wanted your luggage back, and they kept it. Now, after this, we're going to come along with the Unclaimed Property Act. And that meant that after a certain period of time, all of that unclaimed property, all of it in the state, went to the state of Nebraska. When we closed the bookstore, unredeemed book gift certificates were given to the state of Nebraska. they then could auction them off or do whatever they wanted with it. Well, I said to Jerry, this was before that, I said, Jerry, what's going to happen to all these suitcases? And of course, they've got to be full of, dirty laundry for the most part. He said they're going into storage. That's what the law is at that point in time. They'll have to stay there. And now, ultimately, the state of Nebraska took charge of them and sold those off. Heaven knows why anybody would buy them, but there couldn't have been much in them. But there was no attic, but there were other interesting things about the building. As they moved towards the north, and if we had an architect here, this question could be answered, I'm sure. But I've noticed that when you take a building and you add it onto it, the windowsills on the outside will be just in a straight line. Looks like it's just a continuation. But when you go inside, and I remember this in the Lindell and the old Lincoln Hotel, you would walk along maybe 20 feet, and you'd step down. And you would walk along another 20 feet, and maybe there'd be a slight ramp up. Why can't the insides also conform? But they don't necessarily always seem to. Well, now the building was built, if you think of a capital letter F. This is the long side of the F, and the top is along the M Street side. About where the alley would be, just south of the alley, was the short arm of the F. Then the alley, and then nothing. Can you picture that? Well, as they had added on, they created some anomalies. And when they got to the short section of the F, if you were to walk north down the main corridor and going to turn left or to the west in that short arm of the F, you'd have a corner on the southwest corner where you could have had a room facing the north or facing the east, but instead it cut off at an angle, and there was a door that faced directly towards the southwest. Jerry says, this is one of the things I wanted to show you. He opened the door, and it's hard to describe, but it was one of those places where if you've ever been in Colorado where you go into this house and pay $1, they'll lay a marble on the floor and it'll roll uphill. Okay, well, this room was completely disorienting. It came together at like this towards the back, like this towards the side, and completely, literally filling the room was a chandelier. They had taken the original chandelier from the ballroom, hung it here, and literally built the room around it. Is the only thing we could think of. Never did, I couldn't, no, he couldn't understand it, I couldn't explain it, nobody could. But there was one other thing that we said we wanted to watch for when they tore the building down, and that was supposedly one of the columns in the ballroom was a totem pole, a carved Indian totem pole. So we asked them to watch for that, but nothing came of that. But certainly nobody could explain this rather bizarre room where all these angles came together and why they hung that chandelier in there, because they couldn't get it out without disassembling it completely. So that puts us actually right at or slightly over our time period. So I can entertain questions. Whether they'll end up on the tape or not, we'll wait and see. So if there are questions, I'll be glad to try them. However, I have answered, nope.
Well, the top, the little, it doesn't look like there's any access to that except it would go up by stairs.
I don't know about the top one. I was never up there, but during the Lincoln Centennial year, they took the rooms on the second floor and made period rooms out of them. There was like a Willa Cather room in there, for example. And you could go in and visit those rooms. And you could get out into that corner on the lower level, but it's obvious there was something up there because there are curtains in the windows, but how you accessed it, I never thought to ask. And now, I wish I had, and I don't know, it's hard now, even a building that young, gone down that short a time ago, it's hard to find somebody that remembers little details like that. The other one is the Lincoln Hotel. On each of 3 corners, there were penthouses, and those were accessed by taking the elevator to the top floor and then walking up. But this is just one room, so maybe it was accessed from there. I do not know. Another question? If not, we thank you very much, and we'll come back, and you get the same pay even though you didn't have to hardly hold anything up at all. Thank you.